Today we're going to be checking out the Diamond Select Thor Ragnarok. This is Gladiator Thor. So before we do anything else, let's figure out how tall Gladiator Thor is. If you count really the tips of his helmet, those little side fins, it takes the figure to exactly 7.5 inches in height. His accessories will include not quite a twin pair, but a pair of gladiator blades. The reason why I say they're not twins is if you look very closely, the blades are different from one another. They're not quite the same etchings, which I do quite like. Flip it around, you can see, yeah, they are not the same blade to one another, even though if you line them up, they are roughly the same identical sculpt, just the blades themselves are different. I would describe this color as best I can as being teal, a color that I used to love back in the mid-80s, early 90s, and a color that you don't see very often anymore. In fact, throughout the course of Thor Ragnarok, you saw a lot of colors you probably have not seen for the longest of times. They really kept their color scheme to something you would expect to see, like in the mid-80s to early 90s. I really did kind of like that in the sense. It had a kind of a vintage retro look to it. But going back to the blades, a teal-colored blade, the hilt themselves, or the hilts themselves, are a metallic gold. You can see that as well. The handles aren't quite the same either. One is more kind of, one is almost kind of the reverse to the other. You can see the little pieces to the hilt here stick up, whereas the one on the other end, on this side, almost are more impressioned, where these, you almost think that these would like line up and fit and slot inside each other. A nice little bit of airbrushing added to the tips or the handle ends of the hilts, where it's got an airbrushing almost like a tanned, almost like orange color against the gold color of the handles. We've spent about a minute or so talking just about the swords, but I do dig these swords quite a bit. Put those to the side. Rather a little less intriguing is the inclusion of closed fists. I never really get the point of closed fists. Maybe for larger scale figures where you can have them commanding a strong kind of stoic pose. But I always find like closed fists to be a bit of a yawn when it comes to having them included with figures. Especially if figures ever come with accessories. Those blades look so gosh darn good. I wouldn't want to have them just laying all over the surface of wherever I'm displaying Thor. I'd want to have them in his hands. So while I appreciate the fact that they would give us closed fists, they are neither something I would ever want, nor something I would include to the sockets of Thor, so I would just leave them out completely. But they are there, just in case you're wondering. And last, a bit of a head scratcher here. He comes with his electricity. They are very different from one another, very drastically different from one another, this one being a lot bigger than this one here. They are a translucent blue plastic. But try as I might, I can't figure out whereabouts to put it on Thor. It's interesting because if you put it on this side of Thor, it seems to line up, if I got it the right way here, it seems to line up and fit flush against his shoulder, as you can see right there. It seems to drape naturally against there, but there's really nothing you can attach it to. I thought at one point, this little notch here, I thought could fit underneath his, maybe the shoulder area of his armor, and that would keep it in place. But no, that's not necessarily the case. So while it does line up, there's really no proper means to attach it to anything. The same thing can be said for this side here. I thought, okay, perhaps if I was trying to think creatively, okay, well, what else could they have intended for these swords, or for the energy? Maybe the energy is supposed to run somehow through the blades, and then you would attach it to the hands. But they don't sit even in a natural way against the blades either. There's no, yes, this is exactly the way, oh yes, that's the shape that fits in there. No, it's that's not really the case at all. I appreciate the fact that they come included with these, but I really don't know what I can do with them. I suppose you could fit him into his hand, but I don't know if I'd want him just holding electricity. I'd want it to actually look like if it's flowing from him. These do the job, I just don't quite know whereabouts to put them. So there are your accessories for Gladiator Thor. The figure itself is splendid. I downplayed that a little bit. Actually, I really do quite like this figure. It's got some nice depth to it. It's got some fantastic additional coloring. Let's talk a little bit about that as we work our way basically from the head down. So the head sculpt is very nicely done. I think capturing the likeness quite well of Thor. This would be my ongoing argument as to why Diamond Select is the better route to go. So say, for example, let's just play out a scenario here. Timmy is walking into a comic book store. Yes, his name is Timmy. Timmy walks into a comic book store with just the right amount of money to either pick up said Marvel Select Gladiator Thor or a Marvel Legends Thor. I would honestly say to young Timmy, I would put the money rather into Marvel Select figures if I had the choice versus Marvel Legends. You can really see that they put a lot of time, effort, and sculpt into their releases that they don't often at times feel like just carbon copies to one another. I think really where they also trump Marvel Legends is the level of additional paint, which goes back to his head sculpt. His head sculpt not only is a good-looking head sculpt likeness of Thor, but it's got good levels of paint. You've got even to the point where looking around the areas of his eyes, it almost looks as if his eyes are slightly discolored or bruised. That's a good mark, I think, of our company that knows exactly how to paint their figures. It's not to say that if you just sucked the paint off, threw it on the floor, and this was just completely a barren plastic figure, then say in gray or whatever color they would use for the initial plastic. I think the sculpt is still good, but it's really when you add the additional paint to it that Diamond Select really elevates their particular figures. So moving away from that shading, but still staying with the shading, moving away from the head, you can see that they've added some additional tan airbrushing to the plastic in his arms. The coloring, as best as I could describe it, well, would be the color right there, would be the hinge in the elbow. You can see how that is very much different than what we end up getting here, because they add some nice airbrushing there of some darker shades of tan. Almost gives him the sense he's got like a suntan to him. So I do like the head sculpt. I love the paint. Could the figure have afforded an extra head sculpt? Well, that's always the topic of debate. Some would say, well, Diamond Select, why can't you just include an extra head? I feel like they rush to get stuff to the stores. Why don't they take the time to release extra head sculpts? Well, I mean, Marvel Select does it. Marvel Select does, I should say, at times. Sometimes they don't. This particular figure could have also used an additional head sculpt, but I'm sensing that this particular release of Thor is probably going to get two versions, probably a Disney Store exclusive and a retail or comic book store release. Now, I almost feel as if the Disney Store, because Disney stores seem to have variants in the way that they're adding stuff. So, for example, Thor here, I think what could have probably been an unhelmeted Thor, and the Disney Store likely would have been the helmeted version. In other words, well, the opposite here has happened. Here instead, we get ourselves the helmeted Thor, so I'm wondering if eventually down the road, a very near road, we may eventually get ourselves like an unhelmeted Thor that's going to be a Disney Store exclusive. So for any naysayers out there that think Diamond Select cut costs, it may not always be the case that they cut costs and save, releasing additional heads. It's a lot of times because they are maybe tied up to commitments with other companies. Disney Store, for example. Disney Store probably wanted an alternate head sculpt for specifically a figure that people would have to go to their store and pick up exclusively. That, if not be for that, they probably would have included the secondary unhelmeted Thor head sculpt, probably to go with this figure. So it may not necessarily be Diamond Select's decision, it may be the companies that are deciding to get exclusives to these particular figures. Okay. So going back to the head sculpt, again, he's got the markings down the side, the two stripes down the one side of his face. His face is really clean. I could say perhaps it's a little on the shiny side, but I think for Thor it's rather justified because he is the gladiator after all. The helmet is not quite a metallic silver, but a silver, kind of a muted silver paint with some glorious additional blues added into the little slotted areas of the helmet decorations here. So I really do like that a lot. As we move further away from the figure, or I move the figure kind of further down so we can see some of the other close-up looks here, the armor is very nicely presented. It looks as if they've actually taken almost a paintbrush and speckled. This is my attempt at describing speckling. Took a speckled paint and speckled it across the top surface here, indicating might be the slight bit of mud or dirt that's on the actual armor, but it works quite well here on this particular figure. This is kind of where you get a little less of that, so it's a nice contrast that they would have more of it up here and a little less down here, so you can kind of see the varying degrees of paint. Also, you got the scripture running down the side of Thor's armor, which carries also into the shoulder area, which matches the very nice metallic blue that carries from the helmet area here. A little bit of that metallic blue also carries down to the lower shin guard. One leg completely naked to the armor, the other leg having it. And it's got some nice sculpt as well as the color. I love this metallic blue. And of course, the cape is a little bit of a softer plastic. Going back actually to the lightning bolts, I thought actually it has one fix. It's not the greatest of fixes, kind of lukewarm, but what you can also do too, and it's by no means the correct way of doing it, but you could take the electricity and kind of just finagle it into the little looplet here, where Thor basically has the gap between where the cape attaches and Thor's butt. And you can kind of have the electricity coming out from there. It's laughable, I suppose, as that is one way you can go about doing it, but at the very least you can make use of having the lightning bolt at least looking as if it's coming out from his body, rather than just attaching to swords or something along those lines. So again, like there's that. I mean, you know, you can get that kind of going. Not the greatest of solutions, I admit it, but at least it's something. Okay, so let's have a look at this guy's poseability. His head rotates all the way around. Shoulders hinge outward. You've got the forward and back rotation happening there. Arms rotate all the way around. Hands rotate all the way around. And also, to boot, you've got the additional hinge happening there. He has not quite a crunch, but instead a rather nice ball joint happening in the upper torso, allowing you to do this. I could do this until the cows, not quite the clouds, the cows come home, but I won't do that because you guys have places you need to be. He has a lower waist swivel. Luckily, this part of his armor is a separate piece altogether, so it doesn't get in the way of rotating the waist, nor does it get in the way of rotating the upper torso area here. Legs split outward, as well as you have a forward and back on the legs. He has a top swivel cut, say around the top quarter cut of the thigh. Double hinge happening on the knee. And then he's got not only an ankle pivot, you guys love your ankle pivots, ankle rockers I should say, and you've got the hinge back and forth on the feet. Peg holes, by the way, on the undersides of his feet. Don't think necessarily Thor has too many of an issue of standing, but I guess if you want to have him getting a little crazier, you can get yourself a display stand happening, and then Thor can get a little crazier. Gladiator Thor is a nice release from the folks over at Diamond Select. It really does capture exactly what Thor looked like in Thor Ragnarok with a helmet. And before many of you cry foul and say they should have included an unhelmeted version of Thor, keep in mind that a lot of times when companies release retail or comic book store releases, that there's always exclusives set aside for certain companies as well. I'm certain down the road in the pipeline, Disney Store is probably going to have a release of this guy that's going to have no helmet to him. So give it time. I'm certain there's going to be an unhelmeted version of Gladiator Thor, probably going to be hitting the Disney Store. This guy's got a great looking head sculpt. One of the closest head sculpts for a movie tie-in figure. He's got some really great paint applications and he's got some nice accessories. I don't really think he necessarily needed closed fists. You can see he looks quite cool having the two swords in his hand. The only other thing that kind of scratches my head is the the electricity or the lightning that he comes included with. Still can't quite figure out a place for those particular add-ons, as this particular figure didn't come with any sort of instructions. It doesn't happen too often that figures do come with instructions. A lot of times if Diamond Select ever releases figures, it may be just instructions for how to put together diorama pieces and not so much the figures themselves. So I'm still kind of figuring out whereabouts I'm going to put the electricity for the time being, and for final looks, I just decided to slot it in the back between his cape and his torso. It holds it in place. It looks a little silly from the back, I admit that, but from the front, at least it looks like it's supposed to sort of be there. And that's good enough for me. Today we were having a look, though, at the Diamond Select Thor Ragnarok. This was Gladiator Thor. Nice figure. If you guys haven't had a chance to hit that little subscribe button down below, make sure you do so. Many more videos will be coming your way. If you also want to go back and have a look at some of the other Diamond Select, Marvel Select figure reviews, I've got a playlist on the channel that you can check out and watch at your viewing pleasure. As always, guys, thanks for watching, as you always do. I'll see you next time.